This is Landon, and this is his BRZ. This is the wide body kit that we've been putting on his BRZ, and we're going to continue that today for part 2. Man, it's a nice day. You may have noticed that my name has changed. This is because I like it better and because I think it will fit the future of the channel better. If you're watching this, you've probably already seen part 1 of the Widebody BRZ build. If you haven't seen part 1, go ahead and click up here, or you can click in the description down below where I'll leave a link. Before we get started, I have to say, I've been getting a lot of questions about the wheels that are on Landon's BRZ. To answer that question, these wheels are Rando G-Force 18x9 plus 35s. If you're curious to see how they look on the car before we started doing the wide body, I made another video of his car which you can click up here to watch. Or again, I'll put a link in the description. If you want to see what that size looks like on the car after we put the wide body on, keep watching because it's going to be in today's video. We ended up having to order another pair of wheels, and you'll see those after the car's been painted. Now that we know that, let's get started. So last time we did the fronts, we're going to be moving on to the rears today. To start out, we're going to do the same first step that we did on the fronts, which is marking off and taping the line that you're going to cut. Now if you look here, we just followed that crease along the top of the fender, and then when we hit the line for the rear bumper, you can see right here along the right side that we just went straight down from there. So once you make this first cut, you can see there's an outer skin and an inner skin, and the outer skin is attached to the inner skin along the bottom with some glue that you can see Landon grinding off. So once you make that first cut, to get the outer skin off, we stuck a screwdriver down inside of it and started prying it off from the left side and just moved over to the right, and it was easy enough to do that. Now anytime you expose bare metal from grinding, sanding, or from cutting or whatever, you're going to want to cover it with some kind of a barrier. We're just painting it to keep it from water getting in it and rusting. These yellow handled scissors you see right here on the table are what we used for the next cuts you're about to see. What we did was cut a bunch of little strips along the inside skin, use pliers to make bends, folded it over the outside layer, and then drilled a hole through the flap into the body of the car, held it flush, and popped in a rivet. And when you do this, make sure that you cut the inside skin flaps all about the same length so that this curve is nice and even. This may have made painting on the rear a little redundant, but hey, whatever, you can't be too safe. What we did was throw a layer of silicone over all these flaps because there's cracks in between them. This covered those all up and is going to prevent any water at all from getting inside. Now that it's all cut and prepared, it's time to throw on this rear fender, and as you can see, we threw the tape around the edge, so when we hold it up to the car, we're fitting it on there. It's not going to cause any scratches. What made the rear part of it easier was you have this hole for the gas cap that you can use to align it onto the body. Alright, so here's what this sucker looked like once we threw it on. As far as the build quality, everything was really consistent with what we had with the front fenders. If you look along this top line here, everything fits well. You go right along the side of the door, that gap is pretty even as well. And even with this dip in the bottom, the curve in the over fender was good enough that it fit just right. Take a step back and give you a little bit better view of what this thing looks like after it's all tacked on. Now this was a really exciting point in the build because we were able to have the front and rear fender on one side of the car, and when you take a step back you can really get an idea of what this thing's going to end up looking like, and it'll look pretty freaking sweet. Since we've never done this before, we still didn't really know what we were getting into, but as we keep doing more and more and having success, it's just showing us that it's a lot easier than you may think it is. Here's a view from the back to give you guys a better idea of what this all is starting to look like. Even though it's not painted, it still looks good. Okay, so let's take a closer look about the fitment that I was talking about. A really good way to tell how this is going to fit is to look along the inside of this gas cap here. If you look at that circle right there, it all fits nice and flush all the way around. Now if we look along this crease, the top part of the car, even though it's covered in paint, you can tell that it's pretty dang straight. It doesn't bow out at all. There's no real big gaps in between. And it is a little wavy once you pull off the tape, just like the shape of the fender itself. And that's why we're going to use that black foam that I talked about before. That will eat up a lot of those dips to make that line look perfectly straight. Even along the inside right here, it fit nice and flush. If you look at the gap here, It's a little bit wider than the gap that was produced when we put the fender on the front. So that means that if you're going to use spacers, they're probably going to have to be bigger on the rear than they are on the front. If you peek under here, you can see a little bit of light coming through. No body kit's going to fit perfect, and that's why you have to use some type of sealant along the body and the panel. Some of you may be watching this because you first saw Landon's car when we did the video on his exhaust. For those of you, since we had the bumper off, I figure I'd give you a little look into what this may look like if you were doing it yourself. Now this hasn't been on here that long, but it's been driven hard, it's been driven in the rain, and the pipes still look really well. This kind of gives you a better look at the build quality too. You can tell where the hangers are, and just how simple everything is, that the install is pretty straightforward. So now that we've done the passenger side, let's move on to the driver's side. So here's the tape line that we used, pretty much exactly the same as the other side. Just follow this little crease. I don't know how well you can see it on the camera, but there's a little crease right there, right below the tape line. After everything's cut, folded over and riveted, we just decided to smooth out any of the rough cuts that may be there, just to make it look a little better, even though it's going to be covered, and make it so that when we spread the silicone over it, it just would be a little bit smoother and look more clean. So at this point, all the cutting is finished. Everything that's going to be removed from the car is sitting right here in this pile. Now you can see the shorter pieces, the ones that are a little wavy and bent, those are the ones that were on the outside skin that I talked about sticking a screwdriver down inside and prying it away from the inside skin. The glue on there really isn't that strong, and it wasn't that hard to do that part at all. So here's what the driver's side looks like once we threw on all the silicone to cover all the cracks. It does look a little bit thick and a little bumpy right now, but the nice thing about this stuff is that when it dries, it shrinks down quite a bit and ends up looking a little more smooth. If you take a look at the right side there, you can see the notch that we cut off. Some people are worried about that bracket not being able to hold the bumper on anymore, but we test fit the bumper back on and everything fit just fine, so it's okay to cut that off on the end. I'll give you a little more detail about how we threw this on. You can kind of see the holes that were pre-drilled in the fender like I talked about before. Some of them are covered with the tape, but we tacked in that screw on the right side first, then the one in the middle, and then the two on the left. You might have a few little gaps in here, but that's why it's important to keep it pressed firmly against the car when you're putting in the screws. Just make sure that once you tack these in, that there's not going to leave any gaps in between the holes. Now here's what it looks like after we threw everything on. As far as consistency between the passenger side and the driver's side fenders, they were about exactly the same. You can see along the bottom here that the gap was just a bit tighter along the bottom of the door than the top, but it's really not a big enough difference that you're going to be able to tell at all unless you get right up close. Along the top you can see, just like the passenger side, it all fit nice and flush. Now that all four fenders are on, this thing's really starting to look like a Widebody BRZ, and it looks good. I'm going to shut up and let you guys take a look. I mentioned we show the fitment of the wheels, so let's check it out. This was really our first test of how big the spacers would have to be if we decided to keep using these wheels. They may not look that big from the side angle, but when you look from the back, you can tell that gap's pretty big. We threw up a measuring tape and it ended up being about 2 inches. So if you wanted to run these, you'd have to have some pretty big spacers. Now the rears is the same story. Look at how much these fenders swallow up those wheels. The gap on the rear is a little bit bigger than the gap on the front, so it widens the car a bit more. I don't know how well you can tell on the camera, but if you look from this angle, you can see that gap is huge. It's gonna have to be bigger than 2 inches on the rears. Look at all the space that's in here. Here's another view from the back. When we held up the measuring tape, it was closer to 2.5 inches. So what's left? I'll go ahead and show you this rear piece that fits onto the rear bumper and kind of ends the fender. Here's what it's gonna look like once it's all mounted up. And this is the piece for the front. I'll go ahead and hold this up so you guys can see, get an idea of what this is going to look like once it's attached to the front bumper. Once it's all fitted up nice and tight, that's about what it would look like. And here I'll show you guys the notch that we had to cut out for the rear bumper so that you can fit that corner piece on. We're just going to mount one of them, and the other ones we're going to save till after paint. You can see it sticks out a little bit. If you look along the inside, we had to trim some of that off, so then when we pushed it flush with the fender, it wouldn't hit the body of the car. We're going to drill a hole there and throw a bolt to hold everything together nice and flush. Moral of the story, consider this a bolt-on modification. If you can buy other parts like intakes and exhausts and install them yourself, then there's no reason why you can't do the same thing with the Widebody BRZ. Well, my friends, that's about it for part 2. It went about as well as the front fenders, just took a little bit longer because there was a few more steps. And for part 3, we're going to show you the new wheels, talk about their fitment, show you how we take on and off the body panels, show you them after they've been painted, and then give you the final reveal of the car. I've definitely been having a lot of fun having these new experiences doing this wide body, and I hope you guys are having a good time watching. If you haven't already subscribed, don't forget to click that button, and I'll see you guys next time.
That's good.